As we've been looking, for months we looked at the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we looked at he's more than a teacher and looked at different aspects of miracles that he performed. But this week we'll be looking at he's more than a teacher and he's more than a miracle worker. And as Peter confesses, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. What does that mean? And then Jesus goes on and he talks about following him. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And actually the phrase I prefer to use is that phrase, follower of Jesus. And I like to use that more than just Christian or even believer. Can you be a believer without being a follower? Well, in one sense, you can believe in Jesus. You can believe many different things about Jesus without actively following. One of the things as Jesus will look at later on is Jesus calls us to follow daily. It's not just a one and done, but it is something that every single day we have to follow. Well, what does it mean to follow? If you are following somebody, where do you go? Well, wherever they go, right? What path do you take? Whatever path they take. And you do what they do. You go where they go. And in the sense of following, it is surrendering my will for your will. I'm surrendering my way for your way. Now, have one of the big things, the questions that we have to ask when we follow somebody is, do we have enough confidence in that person? And are they worth following? Have you ever followed somebody and you began to wonder, do they know where they're going? Do they know what they're doing? I'm following, but I'm starting to lose confidence in their abilities or their directions and sometimes we can start wanting to go our own way because we've lost confidence in the person who we follow. Well, in some ways, we can even do that with Jesus. As we look in Matthew chapter 16, and I would say this is almost a real turning point with Jesus and his disciples and his ministry. He begins revealing more about himself and why he came. Now, up until this point, Jesus' popularity had continued to rise. In Matthew chapter 14, we read about the feeding of the 4,000. Matthew chapter 15, we read about the feeding of the 5,000, and some of the gospel records mention about how it was 5,000 men plus the women and the children. So it wasn't just feeding of the 5,000, it was far more than just that. People were traveling for miles, some just wanting to hear him teach, others because they knew that he would do miracles. And then there were others who, they didn't like Jesus because they were cutting into their market, the religious leaders. And they were traveling from Jerusalem, not trying to listen to his teaching to learn from him, not to get some miracle done for them, but they wanted to catch him, to trap him, and do away with him. But in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus pulls aside with his disciples. In Matthew 16, verse 13, it says, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. So Caesarea Philippi is about 35 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, which is where Jesus did many of his miracles, where Jesus had taught the Sermon on the Mount. And he pulls aside, travels out about 35 miles. Now, for us, 35 miles, it's a journey, but it's not bad with the car. For them, they would have had to walk 35 miles. And that would have been, a minimum of a day's journey, probably broken up into 2 days, just to get away, And Jesus wants to have a personal conversation with his disciples. This was a big point, a big conversation for them. And he asks them, what's the conversation? Who do people say that I, the Son of Man, am? Well, I mean, we could even ask that if we were to go on the streets today. What do people say when they hear about Jesus? There's a lot of different opinions, a lot of different views, a lot of different thoughts. And the disciples begin mentioning, this is what people are saying. Some people say John the Baptist. In fact, in Matthew chapter 14, in verse 1, it says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Matthew continues on, speaking about how Herod had put John the Baptist to death. Herod knew John the Baptist was dead because he had had his head cut off and brought before him. It was very obvious, but he says, there's something about this man. The miracles, the powers that he's doing, the preaching. This has got to be John the Baptist who's come back. But other people said Elijah. Some people said Jeremiah. Maybe the miracles that Jesus did, they thought, this is Elijah. Maybe the weeping, the compassion that he showed, they thought this must be Jeremiah. Now, when we hear those, every one of these references were extremely complimentary references. Every single one of these mentions were people from the past who were highly respected by the Jews, by the disciples. Another thing, every single one of these were prophets. But even more than that, even more than just seeing Jesus as a good teacher, preacher, and miracle worker, they saw there was something more supernatural about him. Because every single one of these men that they mentioned had all died. And so what they're saying is, this man has resurrected somehow. He has come back to life. Now, all of these things are great things about Jesus. But was that enough? And you know, many people may have good thoughts about Jesus. He was a good teacher. He did many miracles. He was supernatural. But is that enough for us when we consider Jesus? Jesus then became personal with the disciples. Because the truth is, it doesn't matter what the crowd says. It doesn't matter what your neighbor says. It doesn't matter what your mom says. It doesn't matter what anybody else says. The question is, as Jesus asked, are the Messiah. You are the one who has been promised all through the ages. In one sense, they're saying you are not someone from the past, but you are someone who was promised in the past, who would come in the future, and you are here now, presently. Someone that the Hebrew Scriptures had been promised over and over and over. Not only the Messiah, the Christ, but the Son of the living God. You are more than just superhuman. You are God in the flesh, here on earth, to dwell with us. Throughout the last couple of years, through the teaching, through the healing, and even when Jesus had calmed the storm, the disciples began to wonder, who is this man that even the winds and the waves obey him? There is something about him. And time again, it continued to reveal he is the Christ. But the question comes, what does that mean for us? The term Christ, when the Jews were looking forward to the Christ, the Messiah, they were really, it was in another form, you could say, they were looking for a king. Christ, the king. Remember the promise that was given to David, that one of his seed who would become, or his kingdom would have no end. He was looking if there is a kingdom that would have no end, and this one of the seed would have that kingdom. It would be his kingdom. That would mean he would be the king. In fact, in John chapter 6, after the feeding of the 5,000, the people wanted to force Jesus to become their king. But there's kind of an irony there. Can I make somebody to be my king? What does it mean to be king? Well, it means to be the ruler, the one to be in authority. How can I force somebody to be in authority over me, right? I'm putting myself in authority over somebody to put that doesn't make sense. But what is it that they wanted this king to do? Well, Simon's response, Jesus, he continues on. It says, Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." So Jesus, he expounds. He says, yes, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. The Bar means son of. So he's saying, Simon, son of Jonah, flesh and blood has not revealed this, but my Father has revealed to you that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now that next phrase, as he mentions, he says, I also say to you that you are Peter. Now the word Peter means rock, or really more pebble. And so oftentimes people are saying, as it mentions, on this rock I will build my church. Many people may say, well, he's building the church on Peter. Peter, your name is rock, and I'm going to build the church on you. Well, as we see in just a moment, that would have been a very unstable foundation to build the church on. He was not saying on Peter he would build his rock. But he's saying on this statement that you have just made, that I am the Christ, the Son of the living God, on that statement, I will build my church. And that word church is the word ecclesia. It was not a new word that Jesus was making. In fact, it was a word that was used in many certain circumstances. It meant assembly. So any type of assembly that was gathered together, they would say it was an ecclesia. The difference here is Jesus is saying, my assembly, my gathering, my congregation. He is claiming it for his own. This is my followers, which we use the word church. And he mentions the gates of Hades, or the gates of hell, shall not prevail against it. Now the next verse, in verse 20, it says, then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Now many people would say, but why? Wouldn't Jesus want everybody to know that he is the Christ, the one who has finally come, the King to rule and reign? Well, as we see in just a moment, the disciples themselves had the wrong view of the Messiah. And the Jews did as well. They were all looking for a conquering king. What they were not looking for was a suffering king. In verse 21, it says, from that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. This is the first time that we see Jesus revealing to the disciples that he would be suffering, that he would die, and he would rise again. Now, in one sense, as I asked that question about seeing Jesus as a teacher and a healer, is it easy to follow a good teacher and one who feeds you physically and one who can heal you physically? Is that somebody you would like to follow? Well, of course. He meets every need that I have. But is that what Christ came to do? Is it all about me? Is it all about what I want? And all of a sudden, when the disciples heard Jesus mention that I have come to suffer, I will be suffering, I am going to die, and I'm going to rise again. That blew the theology of those disciples out of their mind. They could not comprehend that because everything that they had ever learned and had been taught was that the Messiah would come and would deliver us from all of our problems here on this earth. Verse 22, then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." Think about that. Could you imagine pulling Jesus aside and saying, "Jesus, you're wrong. You are wrong, Jesus. This is not what you have come to do. This is not what this is not the Messiah I was looking for. Not somebody who would come and suffer and die." I have been looking at scriptures and learning scriptures, and you have come to deliver us from Rome. And you've been on a wonderful path. People are flocking to you. They're eating up your words. You're feeding people. You're healing people. People are flocking around because they're looking at you to be the one to deliver. You know, it's easy to criticize Peter. But we have to look at the mirror. How much of our theology about God or about Jesus is shaped about what I desire? And Peter was looking at Jesus to come and fulfill his agenda. He was not willing to surrender to God's agenda. In fact, what Jesus responds, he says, "But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men.'" For us, that would be a very harsh statement if somebody told you, "Get behind me, Satan." That's strong. But what Jesus is saying is, what you are wanting would actually be fulfilling the desires of Satan. And what you are wanting, and if you were to surrender to your desires, you would actually be leading right into fulfilling the very desires of Satan. He says this is not what God desires, but it's what man desires. And you know, when we go back to that phrase, Christ the King, the Son of the living God, Christ, Jesus the Christ, what does that mean for us? When we fully recognize that term, He is King, are we willing to surrender to what He desires? Now, as Jesus continued on in verse 24, He calls, well, as I mentioned earlier, if you follow somebody, what does that mean? It means you go where they go. You do what they do. In verse 24, it says, "Then Jesus said to His disciples, 'If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Just after Jesus mentions about himself, that he would suffer, that he would die and rise again, he speaks to his disciples and he says, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Now, just a few things. What does it mean to deny ourselves? Now, as John Stott, he put it, he says to deny ourselves is to behave towards ourselves as Peter did towards Jesus when he denied Jesus 3 times. The verb is the same. He disowned him, repudiated him, turned his back on him. Self-denial is not denying to ourselves luxuries such as chocolates, cake, cigarettes, or cocktails. Although it might include this, it is actually denying or disowning ourselves, renouncing our supposed right to go our own way. To deny oneself is to turn from the idolatry of self-centeredness. Now, we're leading up to Easter, and some would say during the time of Lent. And during the time of Lent, many people deny themselves certain luxuries, as he kind of mentions. Chocolates, maybe, or different things. Is that what Jesus is meaning about denying oneself? No, as John Stott puts it, it is dying. In fact, as Jesus mentions, to take up a cross. Now, when we think about a cross, some people, you may wear a necklace, and it's a reference back to Jesus. And many times when we think about the cross, we think about love. We think about the love that Jesus displayed for us on the cross. When Jesus spoke of the cross, it only meant one thing. And if you took up a cross, if you carried a cross, it was always a one-way trip. It was suffering and it was death. And if you were the one carrying the cross, that was meaning you were the one going to suffer and die. Wait a minute, Jesus. The disciples could have thought, this is not what I signed up for. But yet, as Jesus mentions there, for whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? In one sense, you could almost say, Peter, your desire is for me to be the physical ruler, to deliver you from Rome, so that we could rule the world. But at the end of the day, what good would that be if there's nothing done about our soul? Another quote from Tim Keller in his book, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And I'll be honest, when you read this quote or hear this quote, it might make you want to squirm a little bit and say, I don't agree with that. But Tim Keller, he writes, the ego often hurts. That is because it has something incredibly wrong with it, something unbelievably wrong with it. It is always drawing attention to self. It does it every day, every single day. It is always making us think about how we look and how we are treated. People sometimes say their feelings are hurt, but our feelings can't be hurt. It is the ego that hurts. My sense of self, my identity. Our feelings are fine. It is my ego that hurts. Now, how many times have we used the phrase, my feelings got hurt? Or we think, ooh, you hurt my feelings. Somebody says something about us. Somebody says something to us, and our feelings are hurt. Tim Keller says, no, it's actually not our feelings. It's our ego. It is that pride within ourselves that thinks completely about ourselves. Now, if you look at a group photo, no matter how big or how small of the photo it is, as long as you are in it, who are you going to look for first? Me, right? Who do you care about how somebody looks? I don't care if somebody else is blinking, as long as I'm not blinking. I don't care if somebody else's hair is messed up, as long as my hair is not messed up. And when we look at a group photo, this is kind of the simplest form of just recognizing how self-centered and how selfish we are. We care about ourselves first and foremost out of any other person. When we go into a group, how quick are we to think about how somebody else is doing, or how quick are we that we want everybody to know how we are doing? And we are more selfish and self-centered than any of us would ever want to admit. And when Jesus was looking at the disciples, that is what he's saying, is dying to self. But what he's saying is, you will never truly live until you truly die to self. You will never know, and really, I highly recommend that book that Tim Keller's, that I quoted that, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. It is probably less than an hour read. I think probably about 5-6 years ago, the ladies went through it. But very short, but it's probably something that every one of us should read every single year. Just a reminder of how self-centered and how much we reflect about self. But as Jesus calls us, he says we have to die to self in order to truly live. But that's not something we desire. And as we think about following Jesus, as Jesus claimed and as Peter referenced, you are the Christ. And many of us, we would say, Jesus is Christ. Jesus is King. But how often does our theology impact our desire in our heart, which flows out in the actions of our hands? And many times our theology stops when it conflicts with our own personal desires. And even when Jesus was being arrested, and we see Peter pull out his sword, and he's ready to fight, the question is, was he fighting for Jesus, or was he fighting for himself? Think about that. And the answer is not very long after when Peter denied Jesus 3 times when things were not looking good. Peter really wasn't fighting for Jesus in the garden. Peter was wanting to stop Jesus from suffering and dying so that he could continue on doing all of these wonderful things here on this earth and fulfill Peter's agenda. There's a lot of Peter in all of us. We want Jesus to fulfill our agenda rather than us surrendering and saying, your will be done, even if it costs me something. Earlier that day, Jesus had spoken to Peter and told him, you will deny me 3 times. But he also mentioned, when you are converted, strengthen the brethren. Jesus says, when you have a change of heart, when your heart has been transformed, I have a job for you. I have a role for you. But his heart had to be transformed, had to be converted. And when Peter had watched Jesus suffer and die and rise again, all of a sudden this mystery began to be revealed to him. He began to recognize God's kingdom is different than my desires and my agenda. In fact, as you go through the book of Acts, you say, how did Peter and the disciples have so much boldness to stand up for Jesus' sake, even if it meant for them suffering and dying? Well, it was because they suffered, or they died to themselves. And when they died to themselves, no man could hurt them. No man could hurt their feelings, because they were already dead to self. And that created a boldness. It also created a freedom for them. In fact, in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, Paul, this is what he says. He says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. What's Paul saying? When I died to myself, Christ lives within me. And it was not until I died to myself that I truly began to live. There was a freedom when Christ living inside me, and I surrendered everything to him. But as I mentioned earlier, the two questions really when we think about following somebody, do we have confidence in them? And are they worth following? Who is Jesus to us? Do we have confidence in him? He's more than just a good teacher. He's more than a good healer. He is the Christ. He is the King. Are we willing to surrender to him? Are we willing to surrender our desires and deny ourselves, die to ourselves, and live for him? When we read that verse, we love him because he first loved us. We recognize what he has done for us. He suffered and died on our behalf so that we could be made right with God. He loved us we love him because he first loved us. You could also say we suffer for him because he first suffered for us. We die to ourselves because he first died to himself for us. In everything that Jesus has called us to do, he has done it for us. So that question, who is Jesus to us? Is he the Christ, the Son of the living God? And will we follow him by denying ourselves, denying our desires, denying our agenda, and following him?